It's that time of year once again. The 2024 Formula One season is upon us, and that means only one thing: trying to predict the Drivers' Championship from P20, unless we have another Nick de Vries situation on our hands and end up with 22 drivers, all the way up until the World Championship winner themselves. So let's discuss all 20 Formula One drivers, how they'll get on this season, and if anyone can get even close to Max Verstappen. Let's get straight into it, and in P20, I've gone with Kevin Magnussen. If we look at last season for Kevin, it really wasn't one to write home about. He was beaten comfortably in terms of performance by his brand new teammate in Nico Hülkenberg, and there were a lot of performances in there that just started to make me question how long he really has left on the Formula One grid, especially considering he was kicked off of it a couple of years ago anyway. And I think he will be able to close the gap to Nico Hülkenberg in 2024, but I also think the Haas car is looking like it will be absolutely terrible, which leaves Kevin at the bottom of the pile. Which also leads on to why I have Nico Hülkenberg in 19th place. And it does feel like it could be one of those seasons where we don't see either of the Haas drivers actually score a point. The new team boss in Komatsu has already come out and said the car won't be where they want it to be come the start of the season, and that's usually where they thrive. So if they go through their normal arc of getting worse throughout the year like they usually do, they're not in for a fun time in 2024. I do think Nico Hülkenberg will be able to use his qualifying prowess to maybe put himself in the position where he could snag a point in a crazy race with a lot of retirements, but that's about as good as it's going to get. Moving on to 18th place in this year's standings, and I've gone for Zhou Guanyu in the new style Stake Sauber Kick team, and I was actually quite positive about Zhou at the beginning of the 2023 season. I thought he had a good rookie campaign and was really going to kick on from that, but it just didn't happen in 2023, and now he finds himself in a team which is really just a placeholder for Audi up until 2026. And I know they've started to add staff already and build a framework behind the scenes, which will try and push this car forwards, but Zhou, for me, just isn't a driver that inspires me to think he's going to pull something out of the bag and really rip up the grid in 2024, so he's probably going to end up quite low down the standings. Another driver who's early on in their career and will be absolutely desperate to improve after last season is Logan Sargent, and I think he will, so I've slotted him in 17th place in my predictions. And look, everybody knows that last year was terrible for the American, and you could argue he's very lucky to still be in a seat. Had there been better options for Williams in the driver market, he probably would have been gone. But that's in the past now, and he has the opportunity to prove himself in 2024. He said he's completely changed his training regime over the winter break because he now knows how tough a season of Formula One can be on your body. Plus, I think the Williams car will continue its positive trajectory and offer him the chance to show that he is a much better driver than he looked last year. Then I've snuck Valtteri Bottas just above Logan Sargent in 16th place, and this is a little bit of a gamble because I do think the Williams car is going to be better, but Valtteri Bottas just has this ability to grab a result out of nowhere randomly once or twice a year, which I think will give him like 1 or 2 extra points on Logan. And I think he'll be trying to prove to everybody on the Formula One grid that he still deserves his spot. It's looking more and more likely that he'll be dropped by the Audi higher-ups in a couple of years' time. And then if he's looking for a move elsewhere, he needs to catch the eye at least a few times to make sure he's got somewhere to go. But I think he's got it in him to show that there is a reason he's been around on the Formula One grid for so long, and he still has that edge of pace which other teams could use. Which leads me to a man who has the complete opposite problem in P15, Alex Albon. He was linked to Ferrari last season, and before this season has even started, he's been linked to a return for Red Bull or replacing Lewis Hamilton at Mercedes. So I think it's fair to say he is absolutely killing it at the moment, and I can only see that continuing into next season. But for me, the Williams car still has a little way to go. It has been improving over the last few seasons, and I think James Vowles is the perfect team principal for them. However, even with Albon putting in amazing performances, the team just doesn't have the infrastructure and money behind it to really surge up the grid. Therefore, I think we're going to see another great season from Alex Albon, but possibly his last season at Williams. I've said it quite a few times in the build-up to 2024 that I'm very concerned about Alpine and the trajectory that they seem to be on through these current regulations, but when it comes to the drivers, I think Esteban Ocon is in the trickier situation. He's been part of the team for a very long time now, and that definitely helped him get the edge on Pierre Gasly towards the beginning of last season, but after the summer break, his teammate was much quicker than him on quite a few occasions. And I know Ocon had reliability issues, but I think if you just look at the performances, he was lacking. So a combination of the car not really improving and Ocon being the slower Alpine means I can only see him finishing 14th. And whilst we're discussing Alpine, I also have Pierre Gasly just one spot above his teammate in 13th. I think if Pierre can build on his really solid performances in the second half of last season, it won't actually be that close between him and his teammate. But I do think he'll struggle just purely based on the Alpine car and its limitations that it has right now. However, if Pierre can make this his team for the next couple of seasons and make himself the clear number one coming into 2026, he puts himself in a really solid situation if Renault and Alpine can actually finally get their act together. So I think it's going to be a tough year for the Frenchman, but it might be worth it in the long run. In 12th place, I have an Aston Martin, and it's probably not too much of a surprise, it's Lance Stroll. 2023 was a real roller coaster ride for the Canadian. When the Aston Martin car looked good, he looked alright. When the Aston Martin car looked bad, he looked atrocious. And he does get quite a tricky time of it. Obviously, he comes under a lot of criticism because his dad is linked to the team, and there's no way he's ever going to really lose that seat. So when things go wrong, the spotlight really is on him. And also, I think we forgot, he was racing against Fernando Alonso last year, who put in one of the best seasons of his Formula One career in 2023, and it does feel like all of that came together and he lost his head a little bit last year. He started to spiral, so I'm 50-50 as to whether this will be his season where he comes back swinging, or if this is going to be the start of the end for Lance Stroll. And to finish off the bottom half of the grid, I've gone for a little bit of a punt here. It's an RB, but it's Daniel Ricciardo. Now, I can already see the comments. I know how good of a driver Daniel Ricciardo has been in the past, and even in seasons where he's been poor, we've seen flashes. He won a Grand Prix for McLaren. He was incredible in Mexico last year. But we also have to remember, it's been a little while since we've seen him at his absolute best, and the injury last season just stunted his return onto the Formula One grid, even if he did only miss 10 races. Ricciardo has it in him to do incredible things, but I'm just still wary about whether he can get back to the level that made him the driver that he is. Which also leads to why, maybe quite controversially, just ahead of his teammate in P10, I've got Yuki Tsunoda. I think we've seen slow but obvious progression from Yuki over the course of his time in Formula One. You look at his rookie season, it was a bit of a disaster. But slowly, he's been trying to put the puzzle pieces together and show why he was fast-tracked into a seat in Formula One by Honda and Red Bull in the first place. He is really talented, and last season, he started off incredibly well. He was in contention for points, finishing P10 or P11 most races, and it was only when the AlphaTauri started to go off the boil a little bit, and then he had to deal with the whole Nick de Vries situation, Daniel Ricciardo coming in, Liam Lawson coming in. They started to fall apart a little bit. And then towards the end of last year, it started to really click for him once again, which is why this year, I think in a stable team that is looking to improve, he can really bring the battle to Daniel Ricciardo. And I'm going to say he just has the edge on him. Then I have the other Aston Martin in Fernando Alonso sitting in P9. And this isn't really because of Fernando Alonso. As I mentioned previously, I think 2023 was one of the best seasons of Fernando Alonso's career, which is saying something considering how long he's now been part of the Formula One world. But I just can't see the Aston Martin car being as competitive as it was right at the start of last season when he picked up the majority of his points. Because you look at the second half of the season, and outside of a really solid race in Brazil, they weren't anywhere close to the McLarens, the Ferraris, or the Mercedes of this world. But if there is one man who's going to get some performances out of this Aston Martin car, it's going to be Fernando. However, I just think over the course of an entire year, the gap in performance will leave him just outside the top 8. Then moving on to those top teams, in 8th place, once again matching his 2023 result, I have George Russell. I know that because Lewis Hamilton is leaving, there's a lot of pressure on him now to be that number one driver at Mercedes and show what he can really do. But if you look at last season, the performances that he put in were underwhelming to say the least, and he threw away a lot of good opportunities by almost driving the car too hard. And I know with another season behind him, his decision making should get better, but with that additional pressure, maybe he makes those same kind of mistakes again. And something that's out of his hands, I don't think the Mercedes car is going to be as competitive as it was at times last year, because I just have more faith in Red Bull, Ferrari and McLaren right now. hence having Lewis Hamilton just one place above him in P7. And it's going to be a weird season for Lewis. Obviously, he broke the news to the world that he's leaving Mercedes at the end of this year and heading to Ferrari come 2025. So he finds himself in this weird limbo, right? Where he'll want to put in good performances, but he also doesn't want to help Mercedes too much in case they become dramatically faster and overtake Ferrari, only for him to have to move there. However, despite Lewis Hamilton's talent, I don't think that will be the case. I do think the W15 still needs a lot of work because they're bringing a brand new concept once again this season. And now, especially with Red Bull bringing a kind of zero pod of their own, that's really got to hurt. Which actually leads us nicely onto the man Lewis Hamilton is replacing in 2025, that being Carlos Sainz, who I've positioned in P6 in the championship. Obviously, it's a similar situation to Lewis in that he knows he's leaving at the end of the year, but his motivation will be slightly different because he needs to prove himself worthy of a seat elsewhere. I think he's got enough credit in the bank to guarantee himself a spot on the 2025 grid, but where that will be may depend on his performances this season. On top of that, we know that Ferrari have always favoured Charles Leclerc in one way or another, but now that they know categorically Carlos Sainz is leaving, they'll favour Charles Leclerc even more, which I think could make this season pretty tough for Carlos, especially as the car progresses through the season. I think it will get harder and harder for Sainz to get performances out of it. Which moves us into the top 5, and I already know that I'm going to get a little bit of stick for being slightly biased towards McLaren in the comments, but I think Oscar Piastri could absolutely fly this season. We saw flashes of absolute brilliance from Oscar last year, in and amongst some inconsistencies, especially in terms of his tyre degradation and race management, but that comes with time and it comes with experience, which as a rookie, you're not expected to have. So coming into this year, he's done everything once before, coming back to tracks he knows a little bit better. I think he's going to be able to bring the fight to his teammate a little bit more often in 2024 and just start to show that he's on the right path to being one of the best drivers on the grid. And then just above him, I've placed Sergio Perez in P4. And I know that's quite a big drop considering he was P2 last season, but I do think it's going to be a lot more competitive towards the top end of the grid. And I think last season, the Red Bull car was just so much quicker than everything else. He could get away with having a pretty torrid season apart from maybe the first 5 races where he picked up the majority of his points. And this year, if he continues to qualify as poorly as he did, I just don't think he's going to be able to make up the places in the races as easily, and therefore he'll be put under more pressure and come under more scrutiny for being so far off Max Verstappen. If he doesn't manage to find a way to make this car work for him and show to Red Bull that he can be that backup to Max Verstappen, then surely this has to be the final year of Sergio Perez in a Red Bull. Which leads me into the podium places, and I think it's starting to get quite obvious what drivers we have left, but I've put in Charles Leclerc here. I think the fight between Ferrari and McLaren is going to be so entertaining to watch over the course of this year, and it's going to be incredibly close and could go either way. But I'm slotting Charles in P3. I think he'll be the fastest out-and-out driver, especially when it comes to qualifying once again, and that will really play into his favour this year. He might even be able to defend a pole position from Max Verstappen, and especially if you look at the final quarter of last season, it felt like Leclerc was starting to get somewhere and really click with this Ferrari car once again, and now he is the clear out-and-out number 1 this season. That should get even better, but I do think there are 2 drivers that will just edge him out. Which is why then in P2, the runner-up in the 2024 Drivers' Championship, I've got the main man at McLaren himself, Lando Norris. And I think it's difficult to argue against Lando Norris being one of the best drivers on the Formula 1 grid by a considerable margin at this point. It's just every single season he seems to improve to the point now where he's so well-rounded. His race pace in particular and his decision-making when overtaking really took a step forward last year. As soon as McLaren delivered him a car capable of getting podiums, he started delivering them, and he is just set up to be such a good driver this year. I just feel like if he can sort out those little inconsistencies that he had particularly in qualifying because of the setup of the McLaren car, he is basically guaranteed to get himself his first win in 2024. And of course, maybe most predictably, at the top of the tree is Max Verstappen. I do think he'll be put under a little bit more pressure this year, and I do think there'll be races where he really has to battle for his victories, but the Dutch driver is coming off the back of a record-breaking season in which he broke so many records, I had to make an entire video about it. So I can't imagine a world where the gap closes to Red Bull and Max Verstappen's form drops off such a cliff that he doesn't win the Formula 1 World Championship for the 4th time in a row. The man is just a winning machine. So there you have it, my full 20-1 Drivers' Championship predictions for the 2024 season. As ever, I'm going into it feeling quite confident, but if my predictions from 2023 are anything to go by, I wouldn't put your house on this being the standings after Abu Dhabi, because let's face it, Formula One is quite unpredictable. And then in terms of my constructor standings, I don't think it's too tricky to place the teams based on my driver standings. I think Haas and Stake will clearly be the slowest teams. I could see Williams, Alpine, maybe even RB kind of having a three-way battle for 8th, 7th and 6th. I think Aston Martin could find themselves in a little bit of a no man's land in 5th place, with Mercedes just above them in 4th, Ferrari in 3rd place, McLaren breaking into the top 3 with a 2nd place finish, and of course Red Bull winning the Constructors' Championship once again. But as ever, I'd absolutely love to know what you think. Get your drivers and constructors predictions in the comments down below. And if you've enjoyed this video, I also made this video here, which delves into each team on the Formula One grid and talks about one key aspect that they really need to get right in 2024 if they're going to be more competitive. So click that link and I'll see you over there.